Hey guys, this is going to be part 2 of our antenna. I would say discussion, but it's ending up more like a lecture, and I apologize for that. But if you're listening to this and you haven't listened to part 1, I'm going to ask you go back in the podcast. The podcast just before this was part 1, where we talk about gain, we talk about impedance, we talk about the fundamentals of the antenna, and so what makes an antenna do different things. Again, I mentioned this in the beginning of part 1. A lot of these discussions are based on transmitting signals. The better antenna you have to transmit, the better antenna you have to receive. However, it doesn't mean that you can just increase the receive ability of an antenna by doing things. I think we talk about the SWR. We talk about tuning it, a little bit of the wavelength. We talk about the ground plane. All of these topics, when you look at them on the internet, they're discussed in a matter of transmit. And I'll take that ground plane, for example. They're discussed on a matter of a ground plane being up on the roof of a house 20 feet in the air above ground, right? And so in that situation, that's what a ground plane is designed for. It's because it's 20 feet off the ground. So its relative ground, when it sends a signal out, is off, right? Can we move on?
The next one I've never heard of on your list.
SWR?
SWR, yeah, like that's...
So the standing wave ratio. What's that?
I haven't. Have you, James?
Yeah.
Brad, you ever mess with the SWR meters in the CB days?
No, I don't know anything about it either. I know we talked briefly about it this morning, but go for it. I'm learning here.
I want to hear.
James, well, I'm doing a little bit of research here because I want to make sure that I say the right things on this. But explain how you would the old SWR meters that for CBs for those guys who ran CBs and had that.
So, yeah, and I no longer have a CB in my truck. But when I did, you'd key that mic up, and you'd have some radios had an SWR meter, built into the screen. Some of them did not. But basically, you had a device in line with that antenna, and you'd key the mic up, and you'd watch a needle on this SWR meter, raise and lower through the roof, and that was basically telling you how well your antenna was working.
SWR means standing wave ratio. And so it's the way you measure the impedance mismatch between your antenna and your transceiver. So when we go back to that, oil coupler, you would measure the SWR, which was the ratio between how much transfer from your output to your input. 1 SWR, so a 1/1 is 100%. Means if you put in 100%, if you put 10 pounds of pressure on this side of the pipe, and you got a 4-foot, you're going to get 10 pounds of pressure on the other side of the pipe. If you shrink that down and go maybe half size, and you put 10 pounds of pressure on the water pipe, what happens when you nozzle down a water hose?
You increase your output pressure.
Yeah, the pressure. So you're not getting any more water out of it.
Right.
You're getting a higher velocity water out of it, right? And it's not as efficient. So that's what the standing wave ratio basically is what it stands for, SWR. It's a measure in the impedance. So your output power from the Garmin, how well does your antenna match that power? And if it's a 1, which is a really good number, that's essentially ideal. A perfect antenna. You're getting 100% of the power. If you put 4 watts out of it and you got a standing wave ratio of 1, you're putting out 4 watts. If you bring in 4 watts, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Brad.
Well, I was going to say, how realistic is it to get a 1 in an antenna? I mean, is that even attainable?
Yeah. If you match it, yes. So you're not going to get 100%. The perfect antenna doesn't exist. But you can get really good matched impedance. So there's things on the antenna that as soon as it goes out in the airwaves, you're never going to quite get 4 watts back in. You know what I mean? So you send out 4 watts, it goes over the air. You're going to lose, the air, the stuff. If you run a long enough line, you get lost. You know what I mean? You can have a direct wire connection and get loss just in wire, not even wireless. So everything has a loss. You know what I mean? You're going to lose, if we go back to the water hose analogy, if you ran a water hose for 100 miles in your house doesn't have enough pressure to push that much water. I mean, you're not going to be able to do it. There's too much loss in that 1-inch water line that you're just not going to do it.
So from a retail standpoint, though, because I think like there's a differentiation here between somebody fine tuning an antenna, because in theory, like even our Garmin, you say it's 4 watts, but if you're tuning based off of SWR, that would change between individual unit, right? Like you could fine tune to each individual piece for maximum.
SWR is relation to the antenna. So it's basically what is the impedance to the antenna. So yes, on a CB, you would take your output and you have to, so the other way to think about it is reflective power. Okay. So, some kind of power is going to get reflected back to the device. And that's one of the SWR measurements. You got loss. So if you got a SWR and here's, notes 3, I found a SWR reading and explains the loss. So I'm just going to pick a random number. Let's say you get a SWR of 3 to 1. That's generally not good, right? That's about when on a CB, you're like, hey, that's in the red. You're losing 25% of your power, okay? So you're spitting out, let's just say 100 watts just because it's easy math, right? What goes to the antenna is only 75 watts. What happens to the other 25 watts, right? It got reflected back. It bounced out of that system because it didn't match. It got pushed back. Okay.
Like it was.
That's the SWR. It's basically measuring reflective power. So you push out 100 watts, 75 watts goes out the antenna, 25 watts came back to the device. And the device just had to, send it to ground or sync it or whatever it does, right? That's what an SWR tells you. How much of the signal is getting reflected in or out, okay? Same thing works. You got a really crappy SWR. When that signal tries to come in the antenna, so in our case, we're always looking to receive. We're not transmitting. But if you got a really bad SWR and you're trying to receive that signal, it's getting reflected back out also. It can't go through that junction, so it just turns around and goes back out. The power does. Does that make a little bit of sense?
Yeah, so real world situation here. When you say you're not transmitting, I guess the handheld, the Garmin handheld, does transmit some things. Like when you go to shock a dog or tone a dog, you're transmitting, correct? Yeah. So that signal out, whatever that is also affected. But then also I've noticed, and I don't know, maybe this is just me, but like, you can track one handheld from another handheld. And it always seems as if it's harder to track a guy's handheld than it is a dog
for sure.
collar. And I would assume because the antenna quality, right, on the handheld, the short one or the medium length or whatever you got when you're packing it around, probably doesn't have as good a SWR as the truck antenna and or the dog collar antenna. So you're not that handheld's not sending out as much of the power like you're saying.
Yeah.
So it becomes a little harder to track that handheld than a collar.
Some of the short ones, yeah,
perhaps.
I think so. Yeah. And that's a really good point you touched on is I keep talking about transmit. That's what an antenna is for. It's transmit and receive. On the Garmin side, the transmit mostly happens on the dog collar. But if it's going out, it's the same as it coming in. You know what I mean? It's like a gateway. It's like, okay, well, you can turn the oil and push it the other way direction too. You know what I mean? The water, you can change the direction of the water, and it can only go a certain way. But it's equal. It's like, oh, if it goes this way easy, it's going to come back easy. So, transmitting it out, that's the only way you can test this SWR, you know what I mean? Because you have no way of seeing what the power coming in is reflected out to the world. But on the SWR meter, or what they call an antenna analyzer, which is what I have, you send a signal out to that antenna, and then it has this little measurement to go, oh, I sent out 1 watt and I got back 200 milliwatts. I know that I'm reflecting 20%.
Well, and really, like, from my side, and correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I'm not a smart guy when it comes to antennas, but your SWR, that's like what you're talking about is your coupler. So let's say in plumbing, you were doing a flow test, your SWR, if you're choking that down, like you're saying from your pipe, in a relation for the listeners, you take that 2-foot pipe, you reduce it down to a foot, like that would give you an SWR rating. That difference between the radio and what's able to be received or transmitted.
It would be the engineers going, why can't we get more oil out of this? Why are we, they're sending 10 pounds of pressure, but we're only getting 4 pounds of pressure. You got to go look in your system and figure out where you're losing
something
your 5 pounds. You're losing 5 pounds of pressure somewhere.
Yeah.
And making sure everything matches up is the best. You may not get 10 pounds. You may only get 9.5 pounds. You know what I mean? Like you're not going to get a perfect. You're going to lose some over length. The same thing with everything. But if you're losing too much, then you got to go figure that problem out. So, and essentially SWR, like I said, it matches the impedance. It measures the impedance of the 2 antennas. And so you want a good matched antenna. And that changes no matter where you put the antenna. If you mount, like I did a video this morning where the antenna was on my front bumper, and I measured the SWR, and all I did, I was getting like 1.4 on my front bumper. All I did was pick that antenna up and I put it on top of my hood, and my SWR went to like 1.2. So what is it? 0.2 is
just by changing the location.
1%.
No changes to the antenna.
1% of my antenna just in the location.
Yeah.
I didn't have a long enough cable to put it on top. You know what I mean? Because it still had some stuff reflecting it. If it's around power lines, if it's around a truck, if your truck door's open, there's so many things that go into what that antenna wave is reflecting that it's just not cut and dry to be like, oh, I can pull this antenna out of a box and it has an SWR of 1. That just doesn't happen. You cannot assume your SWR is 1. You have to measure it because it changes. So.
Yeah, and this is where like all those variables. I mean, we were talking about connections.
Yes.
The screw together, different things you've got from the bumper to how the antenna is mounted to the magnet or mounted to your truck, and whether you're using the fender mount or the other one, all of those are going to affect your SWR.
Correct.
So there really isn't a good way for one. It's not going to be a one size fits all deal. If you really want to go deep in the weeds and figure it out how to be the best antenna for you, you would have to get your box, get that antenna analyzer thing that you have, and test different stuff, how you want it to be set up, and see how you can narrow it down.
And every component, the part that screws on the handheld, the little SMA connector with the little pin, that connection can change the SWR. The cable, is the cable kinked? Is the cable coiled? Is the cable, the webbing wore off? Is it chewed on by a dog? You know what I mean? That can change the SWR. Where that cable connects or is soldered on to the bottom of the antenna mount or the magnet mount, where that connection is connection, that can change your SWR. And then when you screw the antenna on, that part can change the SWR. And then when the metal rod, it's got a little set screw for adjusting the height or whatever, or cutting the antenna. If that's not tight, that can change your SWR. So there's so many components along this antenna path that build up the impedance. That's all that stuff is factored into the impedance. You know what I mean? And so one of those things go wrong and your SWR kicks over to 3 or 4. And now you're, which is easy to do. Now at 4 SWR, you're losing 36% of your signal.
So environmental variables.
Just by one connector not doing very good. So that's why we see two people come in and go, well, I got this antenna and it beat this antenna. Well, I got this antenna. You know what I mean? Like both sides. Everybody says, oh, the Browning beat the triple mag. And I got the triple mag beating the Browning. And it's like, what's your SWR? Is the antenna matched? Are you losing it through this connector or this wire or this? You know what I mean? What all the way along, if you don't have that antenna matched at a perfect impedance, you can have the best antenna in the world with one faulty connector, and you get a 4 or 5 SWR or 6 SWR, and now you're 50% loss. Just one little connector, one quick connect goes bad, and your losses, you lost half your effective antenna.
There's like no baseline.
Yeah. So that SWR is really important. You know what I mean? Like the gain, you can that changes or whatever. That's kind of, you know, like the light, you focus the light. The impedance is really hard to understand. You know what I mean? That's why I try to explain it like in water. But the SWR, that's why I have to explain impedance, because that's what SWR is measuring. It's measuring, does your antenna match your output? And when those things are in parity, when those things match up, and your antenna is at 50 ohms, and your handheld is at 50 ohms, because your handheld could be screwed up. You know what I mean? Like your handheld, for some reason, it's putting out 60 ohms instead of 50 ohms. Well, now you're not matched up because the handheld's bad. You know what I mean? Like we all get those handhelds that don't work very good, right? That's a part of this whole equation. If your handheld's not matched at the right impedance, you can have the best antenna in the world. If you got a bad transmitter, it's not going to match up and you're going to lose power, right?
That makes sense. Yeah.
So it's just geeky, complicated stuff, but I think we can move on. Does that make sense on SWR?
Yeah.
I mean, to me, it makes sense. It's just
okay.
Like all these claims one way or the other. I mean,
so.
Unless there's a baseline in place, you don't know, which is you're going to do some testing, right? I mean, that was kind of
the hard part is every baseline is different. Every handheld is different. Yeah. Every antenna is different. Every truck is different. Every place that truck is parked is different. Some trucks are parked next to a metal building. Some trucks are parked next to a tree. Some trucks are parked by a cell phone tower or you know what I mean, a power, you know, maybe you're parked under the power lines. All of those variables are going to affect that antenna and the impedance at the frequency, at the resonant frequency, all differently. And so in that situation, if you really want to know, you got to pull out the SWR meter and you got to see what's matching up. So we're going to get to how do you tune an antenna, which is basically what people would want to know, right? So let's say you go buy this, and like James was saying on the CB antennas, you used to get these cheap SWR meters for like $30 at Radio Shack, and you would hook up your CB to this box, and you'd hook up your antenna to the other box, and so you would transmit. You know, it would say, you know, turn to channel, whatever you wanted to tune to. So I'd tune to channel 1, and I'd hit the key button, and then I'd look at that SWR meter, and it would basically send 4 watts out the antenna, and this little meter in between the radio and the antenna would measure my SWR. And so I could see on channel 1, I was getting a high SWR, and on channel 40, I was getting a low SWR. Well, I would know the length of that antenna, right? And so I would know that antenna is resident and tuning on channel 40, but not as good on channel 1. And so you kind of want to build those together and get them all smooth. The problem with an SWR meter in our Garmin is we can't just turn the transmit on. It's not easy. And even by pushing the tone button, it doesn't send a constant enough signal for you to measure the power going in and the power going out. I mean, you got to have a constant 4 watts nonstop for that to measure the reflection, right? Just sending a short burst of the way those Garmin send tones and controls and all the updates, it isn't enough. So you have to buy what's called an antenna analyzer. You can't just go buy a SWR meter, because you don't have a radio. Well, you might be able to do it with a truck radio, but I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to talk about the Garmin's. So you get an antenna analyzer. The one I have is called MFJ, I think 259. They're about $350. You buy them at a ham radio store, and that's what you would use, because that sends out a power signal that it can measure the reflection from an antenna. So when you hook that up to your antenna, it's going to have a little dial, and you dial the frequency, right? So the Garmin frequency is going to be at 153 megahertz. That's just the frequency they use. So on my truck, I was dialing the antenna, and I was like, okay, SWR meter. My lowest reading was like 1.0 at 150. 150 megahertz, I had a SWR of 1.0, which means if my alpha was transmitting at 150 megahertz, 100% of that signal would go in and 100% of that signal would go out, right? The problem is my Garmin's not transmitting on 150. It's transmitting on 152.8, depending on what channel I'm using for the dogs. So when I dialed up to 153, just because that's a round number, I was at 1.4. So not bad. It wasn't a horrible antenna, but I'm losing 3%. So what that tells me is the length of my antenna is not correct, right? Because it's resonating on 150 megahertz. And so this is where it's hard to explain, but 150 megahertz signal is longer than 153. So that basically that tells me my antenna is too long. So I would need to take my antenna off, trim a little bit, put it back together, and I should watch when I get to 151 or 152, I'd be a little bit lower, and I'd be a little bit lower. So I might trim again, and I might trim again. And then I'm going to watch it start going up, and I'm like, oh, too much. I'm going to stop, right? So I want to find that bottom, that lowest I can with the SWR. If you can get one, awesome. It's really hard to get one. So you might get 1.2. You might get 1.1. You know what I mean? Depending on the situation. Your goal is to get the lowest SWR you can at the targeted frequency.
So when you buy those, like the truck antenna whips, the long metal one, there's a chart in there when you get them that kind of shows the length versus the
frequency cut chart.
Frequency.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So what you're saying is you can kind of reference that if you were going to make an attempt to tune your antenna
without an SWR meter.
Is that you could, well, even with you could reference that to know which way to go.
Yeah. So that's a really good point, Brad. If I wanted to tune my antenna, I would start with an uncut antenna, and I would cut the antenna longer than I expected, because those cut charts are like a close number, but they're not the electrically measured number. You know what I mean? So there's a tape measure number, which is like, 49.5 or 48.5. That's going to be pretty close, right? You should be under 3 is what they're probably, the manufacturer is probably going to guarantee. That's under 3 SWR, which is acceptable. 3 dB or 3 SWR, again, under 25%. They're going to say, if you use this cut chart, you shouldn't lose no more than 25%. Okay? If you're the guy that's going to complain about 25%, you need to get an SWR meter, and you need to trim your antenna to the electrically measured wavelength of the signal you're going to use. Does that make sense?
And to be fair, just to back up, you said an SWR meter wouldn't be enough. You would actually have to have the antenna analyzer.
No, yes, on the frequencies we are, because you don't have a good way to transmit power.
Yeah.
So you got to rely on this to transmit power.
For the dog guy who's trying to tune his Garmin, if he wants to chase the 25%, would have to get that box like what you have, not just the SWR meter, like you said, not to buy for the CB antenna. and then start with a long antenna and tune your way down until you got to the closest you could to 1.
And
then,
absolutely,
like you said, the Garmin frequencies. I know you said 153 is kind of like shooting the middle of the gap, right? It's like 151.8 to 154 or something
there's
like that.
There's 3 channels in the 150 in the high 151s, and I think there's 2 channels in the low 154s. So I always just shoot right in the middle, 153. But if a guy was really wanting to dial, like I think I was telling you earlier, like if you were really a geek about this and you were like, I only run my dogs on channel 1 of the Garmin, so I'm always 1-2 or 1-3. A guy could tune his antenna to that 151.88 frequency, which is channel 1, and get an antenna that was just dialed to those frequencies.
Right.
And say, I don't run channel 5 or 6. You might, but you're just going to your antenna's not going to perform as well. You could get down to that kind of a level if you wanted.
Yeah. And that would be, I mean, for like a bird dog guy running 1 dog or 2, be easy to do. For those of us running 10 hounds, that's going to be a little bit more challenging.
No, because you would just always make sure your callers are on 1 dash whatever channel. The first number.
So the first number is the frequency. Yep. The second number is that time slot.
Yep. So the frequency, and again, an antenna has to be a certain length. So the way you determine the length of an antenna, so you've seen those sine waves. You know what a sine wave is? If you don't, you need to Google what a sine wave is. It's kind of like you see the power where it goes up and down. It's a curve that goes up. It's a half circle up and a half circle down, a half circle up and a half circle down.
Yeah.
How often that happens over time is what they call the frequency. So power is like 60 hertz or something. So it happens every 60 seconds or 60 times a second. Megahertz is million times a second. So it's 150 million times a second. The signal goes up and it goes down, up and it down. Well, if you took that signal where it goes up and it goes down, and then it was just a string, and then you measured that string, that imaginary, waveform, whatever that string length, that's your wavelength, right? So we don't use that exact length for an antenna. We go with a 5/8, so it's a fraction of it. I don't know, I don't understand, but that's how you get your wavelength. The different frequencies have different wavelengths, and so the wavelength is what you want your antenna to be, because it picks up the most power. Anyways,
I see.
That covers wavelength, and matching, using an SWR to match your wavelength. And it's different. So again, like today, at 150 megahertz, I was getting a 1.0 SWR. So that told me my antenna was dialed for 150 megahertz, right? And I don't care what. Let me Google something really quick while I'm talking to you. I don't care what I measure my antenna. I could take out a tape measure, and I could be like, that's 48 point whatever inches, right? Because that's physically what I can measure. But that's not counting the wire. How much is the wire affecting it? How much is the spring affecting it? You know what I mean? All these little
connections, the
pieces.
Yeah.
The constantly changing variables.
Wavelength. Calculate. So if you go to Google and you type in wavelength calculator, you can normally enter in, it's pretty easy, there's plenty of them out there, but you can enter in the frequency. So if I want to dial in 153, that should be megahertz. 153. The wavelength is 1.959 meters, or 77.14 inches. That's what the perfect wavelength of that antenna, that frequency that our Garmin's are laying. If you could take it on a string, you're going to get 77 inches. So again, because we like these gain antennas that we use, we're using a 5/8 antenna, right? So if you take that 77,
5/8 is referencing to the wavelength,
times it by 5 and divide it by 8, because it's 5/8 is the thing, 48.125. That's the 5/8 antenna length that we want.
Actual length of the antenna whip, like, because it's
so there's physical length,
Yes.
and there's electrical length, Jason. When you add a spring on there, when you got this impedance, when you got that connector, is the connector making a good connection? All that affects the electrical length, how it acts. So it may be 48.12, but it may act like 49 inches to the electricity because
the
of
wind
the
chill
impedance
factor
mismatch.
of antennas.
So all it's doing is giving you a baseline of a place to start.
Yes.
The charts and the physical length and all that stuff is just a baseline, somewhere to start. Yep. But the only way to dial it in any closer than that would be to own the testing equipment.
Correct. So all these antennas are spec'd for, hey, this cut chart will get you within 3 dB or 3 SWR. You know what I mean? If you use this test cart, they have a tolerance of what is acceptable to them to be perfect. If that spec, and I don't know what it is, I don't really know what it is on Browning and this triple mag and all these other ones, but whatever it is, and it depends on where you put it on your truck. You know what I mean? That this changes. So you can, Brad, I can put that antenna on my truck. I can dial it to 1, and I could send it over to you, and you can put it on your truck, and you can get 1.7. And I'd be like, something electrical is changing the impedance of your antenna, and now you're not getting the same power that I was getting.
Right. And that is exactly where the arguments start and end.
Well, they start. I don't know the end there, but I know that's where they start.
There's nothing wrong with the antenna, though. Yeah. It's just environmental changes.
But to be fair, each person's situation, each truck, each set of circumstances, and even the terrain you're hunting in are going to affect what number you can achieve in your setup. And the only way to know is to test and have one of those meters. I mean, if you're going to chase it that far, like you said, you'd have to have the equipment.
Yeah.
So, and that then I think is a nice segue into, I mean, there's practical testing, like people hang a collar in a tree and drive away from it and go, oh, I got 3.7 miles from this one. And then they hook up a different one and they can go 15.
Yeah.
And that's, I suppose that's good, but most of the time driving away on flat ground is not going to simulate your hunting situation. I mean, I guess, again, depends on where you live and all that good stuff.
Yeah, it's tough because it's going to show you different antennas. You know what I mean? Like, you're definitely not seeing. I don't want to say that you're not seeing an antenna outperform another antenna. You know what I mean? Like, people get it in their mind that, well, this antenna is better because it did better than this one. What you're seeing is that antenna is matched better to your system in that situation than this antenna. And that could be different on a different truck or a different person or a different whatever. Or maybe that antenna's cut wrong. Maybe they cut it too short and you can't add length to it. You know what I mean? Like, there's reasons that whole system, when we cut it from our shop, you can't add length to that antenna very easily. So maybe it's cut too short. And you're getting stuck with one of the 2 dB or the 2 SWR ones. You just got the short end of the stick. If you don't want that, the best way to not do that is to test, cut, test, and then cut, and then test, and dial it in piece by piece until you watch that SWR come in place. So,
and that's something done on an individual basis. I mean, that's not like someone's gonna get an antenna that's 100% tuned from any retailer. Like, if you want that level of performance, that's mounted on your truck so that you're limiting the changing variables and you're tuning it in.
Yeah. So that's in the end game. The SWR is like, that's pretty much like the end all be all. And the best way I describe it is, if you're going, if you want to compare antennas, it's kind of like the Super Bowl. If you're going to put 2 football teams together in the Super Bowl, you don't just go pick anybody off the street. You know what I mean? You're not just not playing and not practicing and not making sure your stuff is dialed in those teams are dialed in, ready to perform. And so it's easy to throw it, and that's what I do. I just throw an antenna on and go hunt. But if you really want to see what the antenna is doing and you want the best out of that antenna, you've got to get it ready. You've got to dial it in. You got to sync it. So, we're close on our time. I think we've hammered that SWR and how to measure it. I'm thinking I'm actually got some quotes out for getting some SWR meters or antenna analyzers and seeing if I can buy them to sell them. So right now you can find them for like $350 on Ham Radio Outlet or DX, which is all the ham stuff. I'm hoping I can find something that's we'll be able to sell for around $200. Still expensive. But my thought is if I could get 10 or a batch of them, I might even rent them out or something. If we can figure out how somebody can rent one and we ship it or whatever. I don't know. I'm just trying to figure out if somebody really wants to tune one of these things and they don't want to spend $300 to tune their antenna one time. I don't know if we can do that or not, but we're going to look at that. But that's what we would need to do.
That's a big investment for one antenna. That'd be cool.
Yeah.
So to be fair, buddy, you were talking about doing some testing and whatever. I mean, a truck antenna with a trimmable whip is something that's easy to tune. But if you were just talking like the screw-on antennas that go on the top of the handheld, those are, you can't really fix that. It's going to be what it is, right?
Yeah. Exactly. There, and I did some testing today, just poking around. Most of them were high SWR numbers. So like the short rubber ducky I had on my desk from Garmin, it was 6 dB or 6 SWR, which means it's 50%. So that's definitely not an antenna that I would want to use to get long range out of. You know what I mean? I'm losing quite a bit. Right. Good short range. You know what I mean? If the signal's strong, that antenna is going to perform well. It's going to perform, if I'm looking at it, you know what I mean? The angle, that kind of thing is not going to affect that thing nearly as much. You know what I mean? Depending if I'm looking at it flat or looking at it up or whatever down, the gain on that antenna is probably much lower. So that's why I'm seeing that. But I'm going to lose half the signal. Whatever signal is out there, I'm losing half on that short one from Garmin. But it probably works in a lot of different directions really well.
Yeah.
The other one I tested was like 2 or 3, I think. It was one of our long range rubber duck ones that we have made. It did pretty decent, but again, it was still not 1. You know what I mean? It was like 2.5 or 2.6. It's just all dependent, man. It's really difficult, those handhelds.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm gonna turn my lights on.
And then
for a minute. Hold 1 second. You guys keep going.
Okay. Well, and then the other thing, Buddy and I talking this morning, and he's totally right. All this stuff we've talked about is all related to the handheld and the truck side of the system, and that's 50% of your problem. The other 50% relates to the dog collar and the antenna on the dog collar, which kind of comes into one of my questions I put on the Facebook was, almost everybody's probably had a collar that's been chewed up on the end and it's frayed and bent and it's, whatever. How much is that playing into what kind of signal and how good are you receiving your dog information from a damaged antenna on a dog collar? It's the other 50% of the issue.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's not easy to test. And the reason it's not easy to test is because they don't have a connector like the truck antennas do. And so there's no real easy way to hook it up to an SWR meter that I know of. You'd have to build some kind of jig. And what I don't know, and I'm not smart enough to know, is when you get the bounce back power, you know what I mean? When you measure that SWR, is it the screw? Is it the connection? Because it's not like you have this threaded on coupler that isolates the signal, and so the signal goes through this little pin. You're shoving it out a screw. You know what I mean? Like it's a screw with an antenna, and so there's got to be a way to measure that. But if that antenna is pointed up, if it's pointed down, if it's moving, if it's wiggling,
it sits on the dog's neck.
Right.
Dude, everything changes.
Well, that was that was where I was going with this. You go back to that first graphic that you put up about gain and about how those spherical donuts and they get skinnier and whatever, and the angle of the vehicle depends on, and that donut is basically going out as a halo around the antenna depending on the angle of the vehicle. So now all of a sudden you're sitting on a 10% grade. That donut is going
the dog
looking like a ring out of around Saturn, and the dog antenna is never sticking straight up, right? Like all of mine have like a curve to them, and I don't tuck them into the D ring. Like some guys tuck them all the way over the dog and through the D ring. I wonder if that affects signal.
It has to.
There's a lot of variables.
It has to.
Yeah.
Every time that antenna is moving and it's bending and it's that impedance on that antenna is changing on the dog.
So ideally, the way if you're visualizing using some of those graphics as a tool to try to visualize, right? Ideally on the dog, you would want the antenna to stick straight up in the air towards the sky, away from the dog's body, because that would then be transmitting the donut that's coming out of that antenna would in theory be transmitting the best and the farthest.
I don't know, Brad. I really, number one, I don't know what wavelength that antenna is. I don't know what the gain on the antenna is for the dog collar. I don't know how to measure that. Like, short of, which I don't have time for, but short of getting like a spectrum analyzer on a fancier antenna where you can measure power distribution from space, not just in the connector, what's getting bounced back like an SWR meter, but what's physically getting transmitted. So you'd have to put it in a room. What you would do is you put it in a room that was shielded. So it's like they have these rooms that have these chain link fences or whatever. They're real tight fencing. It's like, you ever think of like the jousting guys where they wear these metal suits or whatever, and they're like
chainmail.
They have rooms built like that have these metal meshing that does not let wireless signals in or out. You know what I mean? So, and then you would transmit this collar in that room, and you'd have sensors or whatever that would be like, oh, I got this signal here. You know what I mean? All the different levels. Short of that, I just don't know. And that's, I mean, I'm sure Garmin's done that. I could.
Well, that's what I was just going to say is, I mean, really, yes, it's 50% of the problem, but all of us have to probably take some trust in the fact that Garmin's engineers at some point did a lot of testing to come up with the antenna that's on the collar to start.
I don't know.
Knowing
maybe some. I mean,
did they save a fraction of a penny?
I don't know if they have their own RF room. They probably do now. In the beginning, they probably rented another room or something. Like, I don't really know, but it gets really. I'm sure they've done some testing because they went from the DC-40 days of the rubber duck antenna to this cable. You know, I mean, and Hound guys. I mean, we've kind of made the cable ones. You know, we were doing the cable ones on the DC-30s before Garmin. So, some of this was not Garmin. You know, the antennas that are on the collar today were kind of developed by Hound guys. You know, taking off those DC-30 antennas that would break and putting cable on and finding out that we could get this. But again, that's a Hound guy sticking his finger in the wind, just throwing something out, and it stuck. You know what I mean? Does it work better than the DC-30 antenna? I don't know. It's more durable. You know what I mean? Like,
I see what you mean on that one.
But that wasn't Garmin that come up with those. The antennas we're using today wasn't developed by Garmin engineers. It was developed by Hound guys cutting cable and being like, oh, if I put this cable on, I can.
So, but I mean, in theory,
better.
like what Brad was referencing too, because he had mentioned like Chudans, like we all get Chudans, or the 22 shell crimped over the end of the antenna, you know, like tricks like that. Those are going to I shouldn't say drastically, but I would assume that can affect the performance of the antenna itself too, right?
I don't know, Jason. Like, that's the hard part of the collar antenna. I don't know of a way to test it. I really, maybe there's somebody else.
But in theory, in theory, all the things we've talked about, just like you said, the bending of an antenna, the this,
Yep.
the that, whatever. I mean, in theory, that can't be
Oh,
good.
it
It has to
changes it.
be
Yes.
it has to affect it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
it's going to change it with 100% certainty. It's going to change what the antenna is
Yep.
doing, whether it's to the good or the bad. You don't know.
Exactly. What's the dB gain of that antenna in that position? Maybe it's 6, and so it's got a really wide one. But then when the dog goes, sticks its head up, now that antenna is rotated at an angle, and so now a 6 is not as good. You know what I mean? Because that radiation
Right.
pattern changed, and it's not pointed towards the person with the receiver. You know what I mean? So there's just so many things that go into making this happen. You know what I mean? Like tracking the dog and just assuming that dog's antenna, like you said, is pointed straight up and working and da-da-da-da-da. It's like, man, you could one day that dog's antenna could rotate around the bottom of the dog's neck. And so now the antenna's, on the X and ZY axis completely opposite. And so one dog's antenna is pointed up and to the left, and the other dog's antenna is on a different trajectory. And so those radiated patterns are different for each dog. And where's your receiver in that moment?
Right. Well, and that's where I'm sure you guys get it all the time, phone calls from customers, and they go, well, my one antenna always is better than the rest. Like I can pick this dog up first every time and whatever. And it kind of begs the question, like, okay, well, that has to be going back to all those different scientific terms and whatever, and those just match up well, the receiver to the dog.
Yeah. So it's just, the best way I can describe it is it's complicated, and I don't know how to test a dog collar. I just don't know how to make the connection to the SWR meter or my network analyzer, or is there another network analyzer I can buy? You know what I mean? Like that's the part. And maybe one day, I just don't want to get that much into it. I really don't, but maybe this is going to warrant me a trip or a phone call or a discussion with Garmin and ask them some questions on if they have this setup, and maybe I can go invite myself over there to look at it. I don't know. Like it's more than I really want to do, because at the end of the day, I just want to go hunting. It works for me. I don't need to get in the weeds too much. It's a 90% problem, man. I don't need to focus on the 10%. I want to focus on the 90% and go take my dogs hunting. But maybe some people do want to focus on the 10%. So let's move on. So I'm going to break in here again. This is the morning after. I was thinking about the antenna question that Brad asked, and
about the collar antennas.
Yeah. And so we make our own antennas, and I can't hook that antenna up to the spectrum analyzer. I can't hook it up to the antenna analyzer. There's two different tools there. Right. But I can tell you what we did do. And so what I did learn, and I was thinking about this last night after I recorded the podcast. I'm like, oh shit, we did some testing on those antennas. And the way we did it is I took my spectrum analyzer, which is basically like a big listening device, and it analyzes the power and the gain of different signals that come in. And so I put an antenna on it, the Garmin antenna on it. And then we took a collar and we put a tough skin, whatever one of our tough skins on it. And we started at like 24, 25 inches of length. And I looked at the spectrum analyzer and I seen the signal. And I'm like, okay, it was, negative whatever dB or whatever it was. It would show me the signal. It was good, but it just wasn't strong. And so I'd trim a quarter and I'd watch the signal go up. And I'd trim a quarter and I'd watch the signal go up. And I'd trim a quarter and I'd watch the signal go up. You know what I mean? And I trimmed it. And then at some point I watched the signal go down. And I was like,
saw the curve.
So the shorter the antenna got, the better that signal came into that spectrum analyzer. And then it started going down. And I'm like, okay, so I trimmed it a ways down until I was confident that it wasn't just like a little bubble or something, you know what I mean? And then it started going down, and it was drastically down,
Sure.
And that is how we have trimmed our antennas at 22 inches or whatever. Is it 22 and a half? I don't remember. It's been so long since we've done them, but that was like the sweet spot on what I could measure physically. And so when we're talking to Brad, I discussed the fact that I can't put that antenna on a connector because it's with a screw. But what I did do was I put the collar in my shop on a at a specified distance, and I had a device that would measure the radio waves in the air, and I was able to watch that signal change with the length of cut that we did. So I don't know what the gain is. I don't know what the SWR is. I don't know what the all that is, but I do know that I was maximizing up. If I made it longer, I got less signal. If I made it shorter, I got less signal. And so,
right, there's like a sweet spot.
Yep. And so, anyways, that was one of the things that 100% I kind of forgot about when I was talking about this topic. So that is something on the antennas that we did do, and maybe I'll need to pull that machine out again, that spectrum analyzer again, and move the antenna in different angles and directions and rotations, and
mess with it.
You know, I don't know that I could fully get a grasp of the gain of that antenna, but I might find out that, man, that antenna works really good when the antenna's straight up. Okay, when the tip of the antenna is pointing at the spectrum analyzer, not very good signal. And so, I might be able to look at, a redneck way of trying to calculate
change
somehow.
The control.
Like, man, I get 3 times the signal when the dog's head is pointed this direction away from the antenna than I do when the tip of the antenna is pointed at the antenna. Then I only get 1 times the signal or whatever. So I'm not positive. Sure. I'm not going to swear that I'm going to go play with that stuff too much, because there's a lot of other stuff I could do that's more important. But
like catching bobcats.
Yeah, like hunting. But I'm not going to rule out that maybe I'm just a little bit too lazy to go do that a little bit too. But the truth is it wouldn't change anything. It's like that's the problem for me is, I could geek out on it and tell you when the antenna's this direction, this is the best, blah 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 blah. But at the end of the day, I'm still going to put the same antenna on the same dog. My dog's not going to listen to me. If I tell them that I can't get a signal when they point that tip of that antenna towards me, them sons of bitches are just
run your head like this.
Tip of that antenna right at me, and I'm not going to be able to track them. So I don't want to tell them that. Anyways, that's kind of the only thing I would know is like, I could totally geek out a little bit more about what happens, but it doesn't change anything because, number one, my dogs don't listen to me. And number two, I don't have another antenna that I would put on there. I've always thought about building a copper antenna or building a titanium antenna or maybe a gold antenna. I don't know, maybe brass. I always thought, wonder what different types of material would change the impedance of that antenna.
Garmin's.
But I don't have a way to measure it. I don't have a way, and at the end of the day, I just want to go hunt. So anyways, that was a kind of a thought in my aha moment last night when I was talking, or in our podcast, and I just felt like I missed the ball on the collar antenna question. There's a little bit more there that I did do years ago that I kind of just forgot about. So anyways.
It's been a long time.
Yes. Yeah. So we'll add that to the podcast. Just make it even longer. All right. Continue on. I want to talk about, so we need to get a couple of the questions because I asked people who had questions. So Jason, let's do those questions real quick. And I'm going to do a test on these ground plane antennas, which we're not going to get into too much here. I want to test our 5/8 wave antenna without a ground plane against the ground plane antenna that is pretty popular out there. I have a couple of those coming into me. I want to check their SWR. I want to check the antenna. I want to put them on a good playing field. I want to try and get them both as good as they can be. And then I want to do a test and just see if one's outperforming the other, if I can find something to say this antenna is working better. I just don't know. But yeah, let's work on some of the questions real quick because we're getting pretty long-winded here.
Yeah. Brian had one earlier that was just asking how much of a difference the magnetic base versus a fender mount can make, which we kind of addressed, because of those, it's all going to change the impedance, right? The location of the antenna, what it's connected to. But as a larger magnetic base, does it give you better tracking ability? Was the second part of the question.
So the first obvious answer to that is the location. A fender mount is normally mounted on the fender, and most of the time a magnet mount is mounted on the top of the cab. And so the height of the antenna is giving the advantage. So the higher the antenna, the better it's going to perform in most situations. Again, like, depending on the radiation pattern of the antenna. But for most of our antennas, the higher you get that antenna, the better it's going to perform. If you want to see an antenna kick ass, strap it to a drone and run it up in the air 50, 60 feet. You're going to watch that thing do really good. I mean, you getting it that high, it's going to do really good as soon as it gets elevation. So elevation is a big factor in the radiation of the antennas. And so getting it up high and flat is good, because you get a lot of the stuff that causes losses, trees and the curvature of the earth and all that. You get back into a straight line sight. So that's my first thing, is a magnet mount on top of the truck should typically do better than a magnet mount on the fender. But you know what the big question I'm going to ask you is, what's your SWR? A low SWR magnet mount on the roof is going to do worse than a high magnet mount on the roof. If the SWR is let's just say it's a bad antenna, it's a 3 SWR, and you got a 1 SWR tuned fender mount, in most situations, if the signal is hitting the antennas the same, that the lower SWR meter should outperform the higher SWR.
So it doesn't matter where it is.
The height.
It has to do with it being tuned in your SWR.
It does. And that's where, if we talk about impedance and we talk about the radiation pattern of those antennas, the antenna on top probably has a more circular, donut-shaped radiation pattern, right? Because it's on top, there's not as much to block it. So if you put a little donut around that antenna, if you put one of them swimming donuts around that antenna sitting on top of your truck, you can kind of visualize it's going through the donut. That's where the signal is going to go. Now, if you put a donut through your fender mount, you got a windshield blocking it. You got one half of maybe that donut's, so there's, so it just changes that whole antenna, the whole radiation of that antenna changes depending on where it goes. And there's a lot of like, okay, it does or whatever, but I can't tell you for exactly what that radiation pattern is going to look like. But I think it would be a little bit different. I think a magnet mount would perform more reliably, but I think a fender mount, absolutely, with a good SWR, will do decent. I think it'll do really good. Maybe not as well as a magnet mount on top and higher.
So SWR, name of the game. That's what it boils down to.
That's my first question. If you really want to know, what's the SWR? You're getting quiet. You're away from that mic a little bit, but
no, sorry.
Any other questions?
Well, Brad covered the chewed antennas. What about like switching from the Garmin to a VHF on the same antenna? So using the adapters, which you covered, is going to change your impedance. Kind of the same thing. I mean, impedance is the big factor.
Yeah. In that situation, and so your frequency that you're talking on with your handheld radio should be a little bit different than what your Garmin frequency is. Most people don't talk on the MERS channels, right? You're not supposed to, but if you're talking, so the way I explain it is if you're talking on that same frequency, the antenna's perfect, right? If you're talking on a different frequency, let's say you have a ham license, you're a technician on a ham license, so you're legal to talk
100% legal
radio, which most people aren't, but let's assume you're legal and you're talking on 146 because that's a ham channel. You have to have a license to talk on that ham channel. I can take my truck, which I have a license, and I can dial into a SIM channel and be like 146, and I can use my Garmin antenna on that ham channel. My SWR is not 1, okay? When I put out, so I can put out 50 watts on my radio, right? So my SWR on the ham channel might be 2. So I'm going to lose 10%. So I put out 50 watts. I lose 10%, 45 watts. That's plenty. I can talk a long ways. I can talk 60 miles with an antenna that spits out 90% on that channel. If I need to talk 65 miles, well, then maybe I should get an antenna tuned for 146. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Just because the antenna is not dialed in dead nuts doesn't mean it's not going to function, doesn't mean it's not going to do well. It doesn't mean it's not going to do all these things. But if you want to measure the fray, if you want to measure the best of, if you want to compete against other antennas, now your 10% matters. See what I'm saying? So to me, 10% when I'm talking on a VHF channel or my ham channels, I could care less. I just want to be under 3. I want to make sure 70% of my signal goes out. And there's a really good chance people are going to hear me just fine. Because I can, and that's the other thing about radios, is we're not talking about 4 watts. We're talking about 5 watts, 10 watt, 25 watt, and I can bump up to 50 watt. I can put more power. You know what I mean? I can compensate for that antenna loss by driving more power. The Garmin's cannot do that due to regulations.
That was like one of the last questions I had. I mean, mine, I do have one question that's kind of related to a topic you and I talked about earlier, but was like that beamer antenna. Mm-hmm. So, like, I know a lot of us have seen, and I'm not afraid to give a plug to Kevin and Nancy over there at Dogs Are Treat, but that beamer antenna, like, a lot of people were giving feedback on it. I know Kevin's said a lot of good things about it. But is that a higher gain antenna then? Because it's such a focused beam? It's a higher
gain in one direction.
Well, it's like a telemetry directional, right? Like, I have a 151 directional in my closet that I borrowed from a buddy not long ago to test.
Yeah.
Like, essentially, that's what it is, right? It's an extremely pinpointed and fine directional antenna.
Yep. So you're going to get a really good signal in one direction. So if you know where the dogs are and you point that antenna towards them, you got a really high gain antenna. But if you point it towards the sky, you point it towards the ground a little bit, you angle it a little bit wrong, now you're going to drop off quickly, right? You know what I mean? It's not going to be instantly, but if you point 30 degrees in the wrong direction, you might be better with a 5/8 weight truck antenna. I just don't know. I haven't seen a lot of those. I haven't done a lot, and it's really hard to test, but because you got to take the dog out and you got to know the exact, you know what I mean? So those types of things are really hard to test. But that antenna is so focused, it has such a high gain that yes, if you know where the dogs are and you know they're that direction, you should be able to point that antenna up that canyon, and you should amplify those. It's not amplifying. You're not making the signal bigger, but you're reflecting more. You're collecting more of that signal.
It's
through
focusing.
That direction.
Like it's channeling.
It's focusing. It's like the light. You're kind of focusing all the light in this one direction, and shoving it down the receiver. So
I find the relationship between that and telemetry easier for me to relay to people, like, because I've learned a lot on this, but like when I'm talking to people and you're talking about that beamer, it's just highly focused. I mean, if
you remember, and James probably chasing those cats, Brad too. You've done some telemetry stuff for the guys. There's a science to that shit. You know what I mean? Like it is not for the faint of heart. That antenna is a finicky antenna that you really got to know how to drive.
So, that makes sense.
The last question the point I want to talk about was the ground plane. We're going to do another podcast after we do some testing on the ground plane. A lot of people ask, what's the purpose of the ground plane? And, I've had it explained to me, not by an engineer, just by a hound guy, that it was a bigger landing platform for the signal. I don't know that I don't know that that's the best way I would describe it. But I don't know a lot about the ground planes. But basically, when you're pushing a signal off the antenna, it's kind of like it needs something to push off of. And so having a ground plane for that signal to launch off of is what helps the power go out of the antenna. In most situations, we have enough of a ground plane that it's not required. So I don't see in on our ground planes, which is different than the ones that they have. I didn't see my antenna SWR change when I put the ground plane on. Once I took the ground plane off, my truck was creating enough of a ground plane that it didn't affect the antenna that I measured. I have not tested one of these triple mags and put that to the test, but I just don't know, right? So I'm gonna refrain from saying it's good, it's bad. I can tell you there's enough people on the internet that will testify to that antenna working better than anything out there that they've seen, that it doesn't hurt. The ground plane, it does not hurt the signal. Some people would say it helps the signal. I know some people have said they've gotten better without it. I'm gonna reserve my judgment because I just don't know. There's too much speculation, and without knowing the details of it, I'm just not gonna go there. What those ground planes before Hound guys started putting these ground planes on their trucks, most of the time where you've seen a ground plane was on the side of a house or a tower, right? And I believe, and I'm speculating, but I believe that's because you got a tower that's or the side of a house that's 16 foot off the ground. Well, you're trying to push your signal with a 16-foot gap from the antenna, right? So you don't have anything to push that antenna off. It's not going to push off the wood of the house, or maybe you got a cell tower, and so you got to have something on that cell tower to push off of, right? And so that's generally where we've seen ground planes before on radio frequencies. That's where these ground planes were initially when he talks about the prototype and stuff. These ground planes were taken off of a house mounting 2-meter antenna. And so again, we could get into the weeds. I don't know them very enough, but I think I liken it more of like a springboard to push the signal off of. I don't think it affects the receive signal as much, but of course, if it changes the impedance, absolutely, it's going to change so if that ground plane makes that antenna a lower SWR, absolutely, it's going to make the signal better. So if you have an antenna with a high SWR and you throw that ground plane on and it lowers the SWR, 100%, that ground plane is going to work better than one without it. So, if you have an antenna, conversely, if you have an antenna with a low SWR without a ground plane and you throw the ground plane on that antenna and it makes the SWR go up, that's a situation where the ground plane is hurting the antenna. Very possible. Like you have to you can't just say you can't take one and not the other, right? It could help you or it could hurt you. And you got to look at it either way, electrically.
You say it could help or it could hurt, but could you bring that back in with fine tuning? It's not like it's permanently hurting. A ground plane isn't going to hurt the antenna. You just may have to fine tune that in, right?
It could hurt the performance if the ground plane changes the impedance and now that antenna is not matching the impedance of the transceiver.
Right. But you can make those corrections, right? You could change the impedance by shortening the antenna
you probably could tune it. Yeah, absolutely. If you really wanted to use a ground plane.
It's not like you're just adding that isn't making it worse. It's making it worse given the current baseline. Like you can make the adjustments and fine tune that in just like you would any other antenna.
Yeah. What I'm saying is without measuring it, without
electronically
looking at
measuring it,
a measurement, I can put the antenna on top of my truck and it acts differently than if I put it on my hood of my truck. And it acts differently if I put it on the bumper of my truck. The same exact antenna acts differently just with where I put it on my truck. So I have not tested this, but I have almost zero doubts that an antenna will act in some places are better than others. So who's to say which, maybe some places it works best here and not there. Like on average, I think there'd be some common ground, but I'm just saying if the antenna just changes just between where I put the damn thing on my truck, What makes a person think putting a ground plane on and taking a ground plane off doesn't change the impedance?
Yeah.
Slightly. Does it help it? Maybe. Does it hurt it? Maybe. I don't know. Like, one situation it might help it, one situation it might hurt it. Like, it's just, you have to measure the impedance matching. And when you get your impedance matching down, now you're getting the power through the antenna. So,
And in my mind, so, and again, I know we're trying to wrap this up a little bit, but like an area that I see from what you've explained that a ground plane may be helpful, like let's say you're out on your sleds and you're towing the little trailer, like where it doesn't have its ground plane, like our magnetic antennas on our roof or on the hood or whatever, fender mounts, they're using your truck as a ground plane. But like, what about like a UTV or out on a snowmobile? Would a ground plane essentially, even if you held it in your hand, would that
I'm
be
going
an
to go
effect?
back to, Jason, it goes back to
Impedance.
what's the SWR? Every situation has a different impedance. Every configuration. So I'm not smart enough to tell you this is going to work that way, that's going to work this way. I'm just going to put the meter on it and I'll be like, man, that antenna sucks. Like, I got way too much SWR. It's a wooden box. I don't know what it is. Like, I got my impedance is not matching. I'm not going to get good results out of that antenna. And I'm going to have to try to figure out what causes that. And maybe putting a ground plane in that situation lowers the impedance or lowers the SWR, matches the impedance. Off you go. I don't know. I really don't know.
So you're, man, I'm going to sound like an idiot.
There's no
on
answer,
this, and
Jason.
I'm beating a dead horse.
There's no
but like, the ground plane
really,
is irrelevant then. The ground plane is the irrelevant factor then. It's anything that changes the impedance. We're just throwing ground plane out there.
Yep, absolutely. The connector, the wire. You're just adding another component that may or may not help it. Like,
then in theory, nothing should outperform the other as long as it's tuned.
No, not necessarily. You got gain. You still got gain. You still got the relation of the antenna. You still got how that antenna electrically connects. You got, I mean, there's so many components. There's no cookie cutter. That's the end result is there's no cookie cutter that you're going to go, this antenna does better than that one. You can get generalized and go, this antenna normally has a high gain, and so it does better in flat ground, as long as it's tuned. But, so the radiation of different antennas is a little bit different. But again, that all changes as soon as the truck goes uphill, downhill. Sure. You're driving down the road and the antenna starts bending. You know what I mean? You watch that antenna curl back and it's not going straight up. Man, that changes it. You know what I mean? Just so many things change it.
It's kind of like 9 miles out of a Garmin. Like, perfect situations, perfect things.
All right. Do we beat this dead horse?
Yeah, probably an hour and 40 minutes.
Well, not too bad. We've done longer. It's an hour and 40. I don't know. We'll do another podcast where we can talk about some of the results, real results that we're seeing, I think. I played around a little bit with the SWR. I want to do some long distance testing. So I'll get an antenna. I'll try and get it tuned down to 1, get it cut to the right length, and run a antenna without a ground plane. I'll run an antenna with a ground plane and just see. I mean, I'm just curious to see. Like, I don't want to geek out too much. I just want to go hunting, but there's enough questions out there that I'm like, you know what? Let's just play with this and see what we can come up with. I think there's a really good chance with the discussions around these antennas, this triple mag and this ground plane and this not ground plane. Somehow I've gotten roped into the fact that I'm a tried and true Browning guy, and Browning's the only antenna out there to work. And I don't really care. I don't like the way the ground planes look. Like, I was joking with another guy. I was like, even if it got double, I'd probably still not want it on my truck. I just don't like the look of it. But that doesn't mean that this is the one with the ground plane is not the right one for you. And I've stayed away from selling them just because of the drama. Like I mentioned earlier in the podcast, I've not wanted to be close to that drama. I'm kind of over it. I've gotten thrown into the drama enough times that I'm like, whatever. So we're going to bring those antennas on. I've got a bid out for them. The exact same company that builds them. They approached me 5 years ago, 2018. They approached me wanting me to sell them, and I've avoided them. So we're going to be bringing those things in. I'm not sure what the price point's going to be yet. To be honest with you, I normally it'd be a little bit lower than what they're out there on the market now, but I don't want to feel like I'm undercutting the competition. But I just look at the prices I'm looking at now, and I think they're like $35 a piece. And then you got shipping, and there's tariffs on that. And so when I look at the overall cost, I'm going to say they're supposed to be around $99 if that's what we normally priced them at. But we might put them at $120 just so we're not undercutting the market. I just don't know, but I want to be fully transparent about it because I know there's so much drama around that antenna that if you like that antenna, who am I to tell you not to buy it? So we're going to offer that antenna. I want to test it, and people can use this information however they want. Whatever antenna you want, get it from whoever you want. Like, just make sure you're getting it set up the correct way as best you want. If that's what you want, just set up the meter, get the meter, test the SWR, or don't go hunting and say you did. Let's go ahead and wrap this one up, Jason. Next time we gotta talk about your trip, and I think if there's any comments, any suggestions, we're gonna do a follow-up antenna one with some of the data that we can talk about. If you can and you want to get into this, we'll put some show notes in here for you to study and some of the stuff that I was reading about. And if it doesn't make sense or it does make sense, shoot me a question. Like I said, I want to follow up and chase this topic with some real data once we get it. So we'll wrap this one up.